Hello. I didn't realize something was wrong until the night I saw my wife slip out of the house wearing someone else's perfume. It was just after 10:30 p.m., and I'd been watching an old action movie on the couch when I heard the soft creak of the front door. Emma was standing there, her hand on the doorknob, frozen like a kid caught sneaking cookies before dinner. Her hair was done up, her lips painted a bold red, and she wore a black dress I hadn't seen in years. Not the kind of outfit you throw on to pick up some late-night groceries. "Where are you off to?" I asked casually, keeping my eyes on the TV, but my heart was already racing. She hesitated, glancing at her phone before answering. "Oh, just meeting some friends. I told you about it this morning, remember?" I didn't remember. And more than that, I didn't believe her. There was a nervous energy about her, the kind of jumpy, guilty vibe you don't notice until you're looking for it. "Sure. Have fun," I said, forcing a smile as she disappeared into the night. As soon as the door shut, I grabbed my car keys. I don't know what came over me. Call it intuition, call it paranoia, but I wasn't about to sit back and let my gut twist itself into knots. I gave her a solid 5 minutes head start before slipping out the back and taking the Jeep, careful to keep my headlights off as I pulled out of the driveway. She wasn't hard to follow. We lived in a quiet neighborhood, and her taillights stood out against the dark, winding roads. She didn't head to the local bar or a friend's house like she'd said. Instead, she took a turn down Route 18, the long stretch of road that led out of town. 15 minutes later, I found myself parked outside a dimly lit motel. I watched from the safety of my car as Emma stepped out of hers, adjusting her dress and smoothing her hair. A man was waiting for her by the entrance. He wasn't anyone I recognized, but the way they embraced left no room for interpretation. They weren't just friends. And that's when it hit me. I wasn't following my wife to confirm my suspicions. Deep down, I already knew. This wasn't a spontaneous decision or a one-time mistake. This was deliberate, calculated. I gripped the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. My mind was racing, every rational thought drowned out by the pounding of my heartbeat. I wasn't just angry, I was betrayed. And the worst part? I couldn't even bring myself to confront her. Not yet. Instead, I turned the car around and drove home. The image of her in his arms burned into my brain. I needed a plan, a way to make her feel even a fraction of the pain she just inflicted on me. But first, I had to play it cool, because this wasn't just going to end with a confrontation. It was going to end on my terms. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind replaying the scene outside the motel like a broken film reel. Emma slipped in beside me sometime after midnight, her movements careful and deliberate. She didn't say a word. No explanation, no excuses, no apologies. Just the quiet rustling of sheets as she settled in next to me, her back turned. I wondered if she could feel the tension radiating off me. Did she suspect that I knew? Or was she too wrapped up in her secret world to notice that her husband, the man she'd shared her life with for over a decade, was lying inches away, already piecing together the truth? The next morning, I made breakfast like nothing had happened. Scrambled eggs, toast, coffee, the usual. Emma came downstairs looking tired but otherwise normal. She kissed me on the cheek as she always did, though I swear I caught a flicker of hesitation. "Rough night?" I asked casually, setting a plate in front of her. She nodded, yawning. "Yeah, we were out later than I thought. Had a bit too much wine, I think." I watched her carefully as she spoke, searching for cracks in the facade. But she was good, too good. If I hadn't followed her the night before, I might have believed her. Over the next few days, I started paying closer attention. Every text she sent, every call she took, every errand she ran. It all felt like a clue waiting to be uncovered. She was careful, no doubt about it, but nobody's perfect. On Thursday, she told me she'd be working late. Something about a big project with her team. I didn't question it, didn't argue, just nodded and kissed her goodbye as she headed out the door. But as soon as her car was out of sight, I grabbed my own keys. This time, I didn't bother following her directly. Instead, I went to her office. The parking lot was nearly empty when I arrived, and her car wasn't there. I felt a cold wave of anger wash over me. She hadn't even tried to make it convincing. I drove aimlessly for a while, my thoughts racing. Where would she go? Back to the motel? Or was there somewhere else they met? Some other hideaway for their stolen moments? Eventually, I parked at a gas station and sat there for what felt like hours, staring blankly at the pumps as I tried to think of my next move. That's when I remembered the GPS tracker I'd bought months ago for our family car. It was one of those gadgets you never think you'll actually use, but I'd installed it just in case the kids ever borrowed the car. Pulling up the app on my phone, I saw her location immediately. She wasn't at the motel this time. She was at a bar on the edge of town, the kind of place where nobody asks questions and everybody's got something to hide. I sat there, debating whether to confront her. Every fiber of my being wanted to storm in and make a scene, to demand answers and make her explain herself. But I stopped myself. I didn't just want answers. I wanted the truth. And truth doesn't come from confrontations. It comes from evidence. The next day, I started digging. It wasn't hard to find what I was looking for. Emma wasn't as discreet as she thought she was. Her credit card statements told a story of their own. Dinners at places we'd never been together, charges for hotel rooms on nights when she claimed to be at work. But it was her email that gave me the smoking gun. She'd left her laptop open in the living room one evening while she went to take a shower. Normally, I wouldn't dream of invading her privacy like that. But these weren't normal circumstances. The emails were explicit. Detailed plans for their next meeting, jokes and inside references I didn't understand. Pictures that made my stomach turn. I closed the laptop and sat there for a long time, staring at nothing. This was real. This wasn't just a hunch or a misunderstanding. Emma was cheating on me, and she wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. When she came back into the room, she smiled at me, oblivious to the storm brewing in my chest. "How's your night?" she asked, curling up next to me on the couch. "Fine," I lied, forcing a smile, because now I had a plan. This wasn't going to end with me quietly confronting her or begging for answers. This wasn't going to be a civil conversation or a plea for reconciliation. This was going to be something she wouldn't see coming, something she'd never forget. I waited 3 more days before I made my move. 3 days of pretending nothing had changed. 3 days of watching Emma go about her life as though she weren't walking all over mine. Each moment stretched endlessly, every smile she flashed me feeling like an insult, every casual touch on my arm like a reminder of her betrayal. But I needed the time to set things in motion. On the 4th day, I told her I'd be working late. It was a lie, but I didn't care. She smiled, gave me a quick peck on the lips, and said, "Don't work too hard." I wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it. Her acting like the doting wife, wishing me well, while I knew exactly where her loyalty really lay. By the time she left for her supposed yoga class, I was already parked down the block, waiting. I'd borrowed my friend Greg's old pickup truck for the evening, knowing it would blend in better than my car. When she pulled out of the driveway, I followed at a safe distance, my pulse hammering in my ears. It didn't take long to see where she was headed. The same motel, the same room. I parked far enough away to avoid suspicion and waited. My jaw clenched so tight it hurt. She went inside without hesitation, and not long after, the man followed. Same guy from the first night, wearing a cocky grin that made me want to drive my fist through his face. But I didn't. Not yet. Instead, I called the front desk. I told them I was her husband, worried about her safety, and asked which room she was in. The clerk didn't even hesitate to tell me, his voice laced with amusement, as though he'd seen this scenario play out 100 times. Room 14. I hung up and made my way to the door. My hands were steady, my breathing calm. If there was one thing I'd learned in the days since discovering her betrayal, it was how to bury my emotions under a layer of cold calculation. I knocked twice. At first, there was no response. Then, the sound of muffled voices. A man's voice, low and questioning. Her voice, a little panicked. The door opened a crack, and there he was, standing in nothing but a towel, his hair damp and his expression puzzled. "Can I help you?" he asked, as if he didn't already know who I was. I didn't answer. I shoved the door open, hard enough to send him stumbling back. Emma was on the bed, hastily pulling on a robe, her face draining of color as she saw me. "Dan," she stammered, "what are you?" "Save it," I snapped, cutting her off. I'm not here to listen to your lies. The man started to speak, but I turned on him, pointing a finger in his direction. Not a word out of you. Sit down. He hesitated, glancing at Emma, but one look at my face was enough to make him comply. He sat on the edge of the bed, his smug expression replaced with nervous uncertainty. Emma was shaking now, clutching the robe tightly around her. Dan, please, let me explain. Explain what? I shot back. How long this has been going on? How many lies you've told? Or maybe you want to explain why you thought you could make a fool out of me and get away with it. Tears welled up in her eyes, but I felt no sympathy. Not now. Not after everything. It's not what it looks like, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I laughed, a short, harsh sound. It's exactly what it looks like, Emma. Don't insult me by pretending otherwise. Her lover, clearly deciding he'd had enough, stood up and started to speak. Look, man, I don't want any trouble. I turned on him, my voice like ice. You don't get to want anything. You've already had more than you deserve. He froze, his bravado crumbling under the weight of my glare. Get dressed, I told him, and get out. Now. He didn't argue. He grabbed his clothes from the floor and disappeared into the bathroom. That left Emma and me, standing in the suffocating silence of the room. She broke it first, her voice trembling. Dan, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean for this to happen. Didn't mean for what to happen? I asked. For me to find out? Because you sure as hell meant everything else? Her tears fell freely now, streaking her mascara. It was a mistake. I was lonely and I didn't think. You didn't think? I repeated, my voice rising. You didn't think about what this would do to me? To our family? Or did you just not care? She sobbed, covering her face with her hands. I do care. I care about you. I love you. I shook my head, my anger boiling over. Don't you dare say that. Don't you dare tell me you love me after this. The bathroom door opened, and her lover slipped out, fully dressed but avoiding my gaze. Without a word, he left the room, shutting the door softly behind him. I looked back at Emma, who was now sitting on the bed, her face buried in her hands. You made your choice, I said, my voice cold and even. Now you'll live with the consequences. And with that, I walked out, leaving her to drown in the mess she'd created. Walking out of that motel room didn't feel like a victory. It wasn't satisfying. It wasn't even cathartic. It was just empty. A vacuum where everything I thought I'd built was now sucked away. But I knew one thing for certain as I drove back home. I wasn't going to let Emma walk away from this unscathed. She had chosen to break me. Now, it was my turn to break the life she'd built on my trust. I didn't go straight to bed that night. Instead, I sat at the dining table with my laptop, creating a plan piece by piece. Divorce was the obvious endgame, but I wanted more than just paperwork. I wanted her to feel the weight of every decision she'd made, every lie, every betrayal. The first step was ensuring I had control of the financial situation. Emma had no idea just how tightly I managed our accounts. Over the years, I'd automated so much of our budget that she never bothered to keep track. She didn't even know the login credentials for most of our joint accounts. I wasn't going to leave her destitute, that wasn't the point. But I was going to ensure that when the time came, I'd have every advantage. The next day, I called my lawyer, an old friend from college who owed me a favor. I laid everything out for him, every detail of Emma's affair, every piece of evidence I'd gathered. The emails, the credit card statements, the photos. He didn't ask unnecessary questions, just told me to send everything over and let him handle it. Do you want to push for full custody? He asked. The question made me pause. We didn't have young kids. Our daughter was 16, our son 14. But they were still old enough to be deeply affected by this. Not full custody, I said after a moment, but I want to make sure they know the truth. He nodded. Fair enough. We'll draft a parenting plan that favors you, but you'll have to be careful how you frame things with the kids. Courts don't look kindly on parents who try to alienate the other. I understood, but I didn't care about the court's opinion as much as I cared about my children knowing who their mother really was. They deserved honesty. Over the next week, I put the rest of my plan into action. I took time off work, using the excuse of a personal emergency. While Emma was out at work, or wherever she claimed to be, I started packing my things. Not just my clothes or toiletries, but anything that held real value to me. Family photos, important documents, mementos from the kids' childhoods. I also started documenting everything. Every time Emma left the house late, every unusual expense, every text or call she tried to hide. I wasn't going to give her a chance to spin the narrative in her favor. The hardest part was the kids. I couldn't just drop this on them out of nowhere. I needed them to understand why things were about to change. I waited until the weekend, when Emma was working late again. I sat them down in the living room, my heart pounding as I struggled to find the right words. "There's something I need to talk to you about," I began, my voice steady but strained. "Something about your mom and me." They looked at me, confused but attentive. I took a deep breath and continued. "Your mom has been seeing someone else. She's been unfaithful to me." My daughter's eyes widened, her face a mix of shock and disbelief. My son just stared at the floor, his jaw clenched. "This doesn't mean she doesn't love you," I added quickly, "but it does mean that things are going to change. I've filed for divorce, and we're going to work out a way to co-parent, but I wanted you to hear it from me." My daughter was the first to speak. "Why would she do that?" "I don't know," I admitted. "I wish I did. But it's not your fault. It's not my fault. It's her decision, and she'll have to live with it." My son didn't say a word, just got up and went to his room, slamming the door behind him. I let him go, knowing he needed time to process. By the time Emma came home that night, the atmosphere in the house was tense. She noticed immediately, her eyes darting between me and the kids as she set her bag down. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice hesitant. I stood up, meeting her gaze. "I told them." Her face drained of color. "Told them what?" "The truth," I said simply. "About you. About everything." Her eyes filled with tears, but I didn't feel an ounce of pity. "How could you? How could I not?" I interrupted. "They deserve to know what kind of person their mother is." She tried to argue, but I cut her off again. "Save it, Emma. The damage is done. Now it's your turn to deal with the fallout." And with that, I walked away, leaving her standing there in the wreckage of her own making. Emma avoided me for the next 2 days. She didn't say a word about what I'd told the kids, but I knew she was furious. I could feel it in the way she moved around the house, silent but deliberate, slamming cabinet doors just hard enough to make a point, lingering in rooms as though waiting for me to acknowledge her. I didn't give her the satisfaction. The kids were distant too, retreating into their rooms whenever she was home. I overheard snippets of conversations, my daughter telling her friends that her family was a mess, my son muttering angrily to himself about how he'd always thought mom was the good parent. By the third night, I knew the silence couldn't last. Sure enough, after the kids went to bed, Emma cornered me in the living room. She stood there, arms crossed, her face a mix of anger and desperation. "We need to talk," she said, her voice low but firm. I closed the laptop I'd been pretending to work on and gestured for her to sit. She didn't. "What the hell are you doing, Dan?" she demanded. "Telling the kids like that? Turning them against me? What's wrong with you?" I looked at her, unflinching. "What's wrong with me? You're really going to ask that, Emma? You cheated. You lied. You threw away everything we built, and now you want to blame me for being honest with our children." Her expression flickered, but she didn't back down. "You didn't have to tell them. Not like that. They're just kids. They don't understand." "They're old enough to understand betrayal," I shot back. "And they deserve the truth. I'm not going to sugarcoat your mistakes just to make things easier for you." Her voice cracked as she replied, "It wasn't supposed to happen like this." "Then how was it supposed to happen?" I demanded, standing now, unable to keep my anger contained. "Were you planning to keep lying? Keep sneaking around? Or were you hoping I'd just look the other way and let you have your fun?" Tears welled up in her eyes, but I didn't feel sorry for her. Not anymore. "I made a mistake," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I wasn't happy, Dan. I didn't know how to tell you." I laughed bitterly. "So instead of talking to me, you decided to sleep with someone else. Great problem solving, Emma." "It wasn't like that," she protested. I didn't plan for this to happen. It happened. I shook my head, disgusted. You keep saying that like it's supposed to make me feel better. Like the fact that you didn't plan to destroy our marriage makes it any less devastating. She wiped at her eyes, struggling to keep her composure. I still love you, Dan. I know I screwed up, but I want to fix this. For us. For the kids. Her words hung in the air, heavy with desperation. For a moment, I almost believed her. Almost. Love? I said, my voice colder than I intended. You don't destroy the people you love, Emma. You don't lie to them, betray them, humiliate them. Whatever you feel for me, it's not love. She flinched as though I'd slapped her. I'm willing to do whatever it takes, she said, her voice trembling. Counseling, therapy, anything. Just tell me what you want, and I'll do it. I stared at her, my heart heavy with anger and exhaustion. Part of me wanted to yell, to scream, to demand answers she didn't have. But another part of me was just done. You had your chance, Emma, I said finally. You could have come to me when you were unhappy. You could have told me how you felt, and we could have worked through it together. But you didn't. You made a choice, and now you have to live with it. Tears streamed down her face as she pleaded. Please, Dan, don't throw everything away. Don't let this be the end. This isn't my choice, I replied. You ended this the moment you walked into that motel with him. I'm just making it official. She sank into the nearest chair, her face buried in her hands. I could hear her sobbing, but I felt nothing. No sympathy, no sadness. Just a cold, empty certainty that this was the only way forward. I'll be moving out next week, I said, my voice steady despite the ache in my chest. The divorce papers are ready, and I'll have my lawyer send them over. I'm not asking for full custody, but I do want joint. We'll work out a schedule that makes sense for the kids. She didn't respond, just sat there, her shoulders shaking. I hope, for their sake, you take this time to reflect on what you've done, I added. They still need you, even if I don't. With that, I turned and walked upstairs, leaving her to her grief. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. There was no going back now. The morning after that last conversation was eerily quiet. Emma stayed in bed longer than usual, and when she finally came downstairs, she looked like a shadow of the person she'd been just a week ago. Her makeup was smudged, her hair unkempt, and her eyes red from crying. She didn't speak to me, and I didn't make an effort to speak to her. The air between us was thick with everything that had been said, and everything that hadn't. I spent the day finalizing my move. Most of my personal items were already packed, but now I focused on the essentials. Clothes, my work equipment, and anything I didn't want to leave behind. I called a moving company to arrange for the bigger items to be picked up later in the week. Emma didn't try to stop me, nor did she offer any help. She just sat at the kitchen table, staring blankly out the window, her hands wrapped around a coffee mug she wasn't drinking from. The kids were another story. My daughter cornered me while I was packing my office, her face a mask of anger and confusion. Why do you have to leave? She demanded, her voice sharp. Why can't you just stay and figure things out? Isn't that what families do? I stopped what I was doing and looked at her, my heart breaking at the hurt in her eyes. Sweetheart, I said gently, this isn't something that can be fixed. Your mom and I, we've reached a point where staying together would only hurt us, and you more. But you love her, don't you? She pressed, her voice cracking. I did, I admitted, my throat tight. I loved her with everything I had. But love isn't enough when trust is gone. Her face crumpled, and I pulled her into a hug, holding her as she cried. My son, on the other hand, had shut down completely. He avoided me, barely spoke, and refused to acknowledge Emma at all. I knew he needed time, but it still hurt to see him retreat into himself. When moving day arrived, it was both easier and harder than I'd imagined. The movers were efficient, loading my things into the truck with practiced ease, while I stood by and supervised. Emma watched from the porch, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her face blank. She hadn't said a word to me since our last conversation, and I hadn't tried to change that. Once everything was packed, I turned to the kids, who were standing awkwardly by the front door. My daughter hugged me tightly, tears streaming down her face. while my son gave me a brief, stiff embrace before stepping back. "I'll be back to pick you up for the weekend," I told them, my voice steady despite the lump in my throat. "And if you need me before then, you can call anytime." "Okay." They nodded, and I turned to leave, my chest tight as I walked to my car. Emma didn't say goodbye. The first few weeks on my own were rough. I moved into a small rental house a few miles away, close enough to stay involved with the kids, but far enough to create the distance I needed. The silence was deafening at first, but I filled it with work, trips to the gym, and evenings spent catching up with old friends. I wasn't trying to distract myself, I was trying to rebuild. The kids adjusted slowly. My daughter started opening up during our weekends together, asking questions about the divorce and what it meant for the future. My son was harder to reach, but I made a point to be patient, letting him come to me when he was ready. Emma, as far as I knew, was struggling. The kids mentioned that she'd been quiet and withdrawn, spending most of her time at home or at work. I didn't ask for details. It wasn't my place anymore. The divorce itself was surprisingly smooth. My lawyer was thorough, ensuring that the division of assets was fair but left me in a solid position. Emma didn't fight me on custody or finances, perhaps out of guilt, or perhaps because she knew she didn't have a leg to stand on. By the time the papers were signed and everything was finalized, I felt a strange sense of relief. It wasn't happiness, exactly, but it was the closest thing to peace I'd felt in months. One evening, a few weeks after the divorce was finalized, Emma called me. It was the first time she'd reached out since I'd left, and her voice was hesitant. "Can we talk?" she asked. I hesitated, but agreed. We met at a coffee shop, neutral territory where neither of us would feel cornered. She looked nervous, her hands trembling slightly as she stirred her coffee. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry," she began, her voice thick with emotion. "For everything. I know I can't undo what I did, but I want you to know that I regret it more than I can say." I nodded, letting her speak. "I didn't realize how much I was hurting you," she continued, "or the kids. I was selfish, and I ruined everything. I needed you to know that." Her apology was sincere, but it didn't change anything. "I appreciate that," I said finally, "but this doesn't fix what's broken. We're done, Emma. That's not going to change." She nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I know. I just needed to say it." When we parted ways that night, I felt a strange mix of emotions: sadness for what we'd lost, anger at what she'd done, and a quiet sense of closure. Life didn't go back to normal after that. It never would. But over time, it became something new, something better. I focused on being the best father I could be, building a life that was stronger and more fulfilling than the one I'd left behind. And as for Emma, I hope she found her own way forward, whatever that looked like. Because for me, the chapter was closed. Thanks for watching. Rate the story in the comments. Subscribe to the channel. Bye-bye.